The first time my wife told me she hated me, she was sipping wine like it was business as usual. No shouting, no slamming doors, no tears, just a calm declaration as if she were noting the weather. Her lipstick clung to the rim of the glass, her hand steady, her gaze set on the city skyline instead of me. I remember standing there, halfway between the living room and kitchen, my jacket still on from work. I thought she was joking. A twisted sense of humor maybe, some dark flirtation I hadn't yet learned to appreciate. But when she turned her eyes toward me, cold and deliberate, I knew she meant it. It's strange. People imagine hate as fire, rage, fists pounding tables. But the kind of hate my wife had was colder. It was the hate of someone who believed she had already won, and I was simply too blind to notice. We hadn't started this way. I was just another employee at her company, low-level analyst, tucked into a corner cubicle with a squeaky chair and an outdated monitor. She was the CEO, untouchable, surrounded by glass offices and whispered respect. Our worlds weren't supposed to touch. But then she did something no one expected, she noticed me. I still remember the day she leaned against my desk, crossing her arms, eyes locked on me like she was dissecting a specimen. "You're wasted here," she said, and it felt less like a compliment and more like a command. Weeks later, dinners followed. Expensive restaurants where she never looked at the menu because the chef already knew her favorites. I couldn't even pronounce half the dishes, but I smiled and tried. She said she liked my honesty, my normalcy, that I wasn't plastic like the men she usually met. And I believed her. Our marriage was fast, too fast. Her penthouse swallowed me whole, high ceilings, imported furniture, artwork worth more than my parents' house. I told myself I was adapting, adjusting to her world. But looking back, I realize I was shrinking, piece by piece. She paid for everything. My clothes, my car, even my phone. When I once offered to split a dinner bill, she laughed like it was a child's joke. "Don't embarrass yourself," she said, sliding the black leather folder back to the waiter. At first, I told myself it was fine. She had more, so she gave more. But it wasn't generosity, it was control. Every gift a leash, every luxury a reminder that without her, I was nothing. And yet, I loved her. Or maybe I loved the version of myself I thought I became when she chose me. But the cracks started small. Late-night texts she said were from colleagues. "Work never sleeps at this level," she explained, eyes fixed on her screen, fingers typing faster than her lips could form the excuses. Then there were the credit card charges, boutiques she never visited with me, restaurants out of town. I asked once, lightly, half laughing, if she was seeing someone else. She didn't even look up from her phone. Don't be pathetic. That word. Pathetic. It stuck to me like tar. The worst was at night. She talked in her sleep sometimes. Whispered names. Not mine. One night, I heard her murmur, "Mark," with a softness she never gave me, her hand twitching against the silk sheets like she was reaching for him in her dreams. I lay there frozen, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was just the decoy in a marriage staged for appearances. Still, I told myself it was paranoia. That love requires trust, even when it hurts. But paranoia doesn't explain what I saw next. One morning, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I don't know why I reached for it, maybe instinct, maybe desperation. The screen lit up with a message. Just one line, but it was enough to gut me. "He suspects nothing. M." And in that moment, standing in our bedroom with steam hissing from the bathroom door, I realized I had been living inside a lie. I grew up in a house where the walls peeled and the bills piled up like bricks we could never climb over. My father worked nights at a warehouse, my mother stitched clothes in the living room until her back gave out. We weren't poor enough to starve, but we were always a step away from the edge: eviction notices, power shutoffs, borrowed money from relatives who were just as broke. That kind of childhood doesn't leave you. It follows you into every decision, every relationship, every smile you try to fake in rooms where everyone else belongs. For me, stability wasn't a luxury, it was oxygen. I swore I'd claw my way into a life where money wasn't a daily monster breathing down my neck. Then came her. I first saw her in the company cafeteria. Not the kind of place a CEO usually walks into, but she had this way of crossing thresholds like she owned the world, because she did. She was magnetic. Perfectly tailored suit, hair sleek, eyes sharp enough to slice through the cheap plastic trays and fluorescent lights. When she looked at me, really looked at me, I forgot my name. She was everything I wasn't: composed, wealthy, powerful. And yet, she chose me. That's what made her irresistible. Not just her beauty, though she was stunning in a way that made people whisper when she passed, but the fact that someone like her, someone untouchable, reached down into the crowd and picked me. She once said, "I'll take care of you." For words I didn't realize would shape the rest of my life. At the time, they felt like a promise. To someone like me, who had never known ease, it was intoxicating. Who wouldn't want to be taken care of? But there's a price hidden in every promise. The more she gave, the smaller I became. She paid my student loans without asking. She upgraded my car, told me the old one was embarrassing. She moved me into her penthouse, and I left behind my tiny apartment with its thrift store furniture like it was something dirty I had to shed. At first, I convinced myself it was love expressed through generosity. But slowly, I realized generosity wasn't the point, control was. When I talked about applying for a promotion, she laughed. "Why bother? You don't need it. I make more in a week than you will in a year." When I mentioned wanting to start a business one day, she rolled her eyes. "Stick to what you know. Dreams don't pay bills." Her words chipped at me, one sharp edge at a time. I stopped talking about my ambitions because she made me feel stupid for having them. I stopped reaching out to friends because she called them leeches. Family visits grew rare, always inconvenient with her schedule. Before I knew it, my entire world revolved around her orbit. And she liked it that way. But there were cracks in her performance, little glimpses that she wasn't what she pretended to be. She never said, "I love you," unless she was drunk. Sober, it was always, "I need you," or "You're mine," or sometimes nothing at all. I'd wait for the words, desperate to hear them, but they never came without alcohol loosening her tongue. It gnawed at me in quiet hours. Did she ever really love me? Or was I just another acquisition, something to flaunt? A project to prove she could take nobody and dress him in silk until he looked like somebody? The night I found the photo, I stopped pretending. It was late. She was asleep in the bedroom, the steady rise and fall of her breath almost peaceful. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered her office, a sleek, glass-walled room with books she never read and awards engraved with her name. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe reassurance, maybe proof that I mattered. That's when I noticed the drawer. Bottom right of her desk. Locked. I should have left it alone, but something in me snapped. I rummaged through her jewelry box until I found a thin hairpin, and with trembling hands, I forced the lock. The drawer slid open with a sigh, like it had been waiting for me. Inside were folders, receipts, documents, her private world. But tucked between them was a photo. A small, glossy square, tucked into a manila folder like it didn't belong. It was her. And another man. They were laughing, his arm around her waist, her face tilted up toward him like sunlight. I froze, my stomach flipping as I realized when it was taken, she was wearing the white dress from our honeymoon. The same trip where she told me I was the best decision she'd ever made. But there she was, pressed against someone else, looking more alive than she ever did with me. My hand shook so badly the photo slipped to the floor. I stared at it, my mind trying to deny what my eyes couldn't see. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't paranoia or insecurity. It was the truth, undeniable, physical proof. And the worst part wasn't even the betrayal. The worst part was how happy she looked with him. The photo gnawed at me for days. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I carried it in my pocket like a toxin I couldn't let go of. Every time she smiled at me, every time she kissed my cheek with that cold, performative affection, I felt the weight of that photo burning through the fabric. But it wasn't enough. One photo wasn't the whole truth. I needed more. And then the pieces started falling into place. The first piece came from her phone. I didn't go looking, at least not at first. But when she left it face down at dinner one night, buzzing non-stop, something inside me cracked. I flipped it over. Messages. Dozens of them. Some deleted, some poorly hidden in a folder named Work. One stood out: I miss last night. You looked perfect at the hotel. M. M, the same initial from the message weeks before. My blood ran cold. It didn't take long to confirm. A name attached to the number: Marcus Hale. Board member. Older, wealthy, the kind of man who had been circling her orbit for years. I'd seen him at company parties: silver hair, sharp suits, the kind of confidence money calcifies into arrogance. And she had chosen him. The second piece came from a friend I hadn't seen in months. We ran into each other by chance at a bar across town. He hesitated when he saw me, pity already in his eyes. After a few drinks, his guilt spilled out. Look, man. I don't know how to tell you this. But she talks about you. Not in a good way. What do you mean? I asked, my voice already trembling. She calls you her charity case. Says she keeps you around because you make her look grounded, relatable. Like she's doing some social experiment. People laugh, man. I didn't want to believe it, but she brags about it. I felt the air leave my lungs. Charity case. The word ricocheted inside me like shrapnel. I staggered out of the bar before he could say more. The third piece was financial. Bills started arriving in my name, bills I never authorized. Bank statements with transfers I didn't make. When I confronted her, she brushed me off. It's all handled, don't worry about it. But my signature was on documents I'd never seen. My credit cards maxed with charges I didn't recognize. That's when the panic attack started. Nights blurred into each other. I'd wake at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a trapped animal. My mind spiraled through fragments: her laughter with Marcus, her friends' whispers, the word charity. I stopped eating, dropped weight, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. She'd sleep peacefully beside me, her phone buzzing against the nightstand, while I slowly unraveled. I told myself I needed answers. But what I wanted, what I really wanted, was for her to deny it. To prove me wrong. To tell me it was all in my head. So I confronted her. It was in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. I slammed the photo on the counter. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me, utterly unbothered. Who is he? I demanded, my voice breaking. She didn't even blink. You already know. The casual cruelty of it cut deeper than any lie. How long? Since before the wedding, she said, pouring herself another glass of wine like. It was a perfectly ordinary conversation. I staggered back. You married me while sleeping with him? She swirled the glass, watching the crimson liquid catch the light. I married you because you were useful. The words didn't register at first. Useful? You were never my equal, she said calmly. You were my project. An experiment. The ordinary man I could dress up and display to prove I wasn't just another Ice Queen executive. You made me look human. Relatable. Approachable to shareholders. That's all you ever were. Her voice was steady, cold, and practiced. She might as well have been reciting a business plan. My knees nearly gave out. So none of it was real. She smirked. Oh, don't look so shocked. You got something out of it too. The car, the penthouse, the lifestyle. You think you'd ever have that without me? I wanted to scream, to throw the glass from her hand, to make her hurt the way she had just hollowed me out. But all I could do was stand there, trembling, while she drained her wine and left the room, her heels clicking like a metronome of indifference. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words replaying over and over. You were my project. My charity case. Each syllable carved into me like a brand. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A week later, while sorting through the pile of bills, I found an envelope tucked into the stack. Thick paper, embossed with the logo of her law firm. Inside was a copy of the prenup. I'd seen it before, briefly, when she shoved it in front of me before the wedding. She smiled, kissed me, and said, just a formality. I signed without reading. Back then, I was blinded by her promise to take care of me. Now, I read every word. And what I found made my stomach drop. The clauses were ironclad. If I filed for divorce, I would walk away with nothing. Not just nothing, worse. Hidden in the legal jargon was a clause that transferred certain debts into my name. Loans, investments, losses, all tied to me if I dared leave her. It wasn't just a marriage. It was a trap. She hadn't only taken my love. She had taken my freedom. And for the first time, rage cut through the despair. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, watching a man I barely recognized. The glass was spiderwebbed from an old accident, one more thing in my life that needed fixing. I touched a crack with my fingertip and, for the first time since the photo, I did not flinch. I saw the fracture lines and instead of recoil, I began to map them. Each shard reflected a different version of me, the lover, the fool, the kept man, the defeated husband. I smashed the rest with the heel of my hand until the mirror fell inward and clattered against the tiles. The sound felt like permission. You learn quickly, when your life is stripped, to use what's left. I had no money that was really mine, no allies in the circles that mattered. And a reputation she'd built to make me look like the quaint accessory at her side. But I did have brains. I had a memory. I had knowledge of small, awkward things about her routine that only a husband would know. I had the element she never counted on, invisibility. She believed I was harmless. I intended to make that hubris my weapon. Step 1 was quiet. I stayed small in public. I limped through dinners and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I let her dismiss me and call me pathetic. To her I became the broken ornament she could polish when it pleased her. He's fragile, she told acquaintances at the gala. He's sweet. She said pity should be a compliment. Underestimate me, I thought. Underestimate me and you will show me your skeleton. At home, I began gathering proof. I kept receipts that didn't belong to me. I learned to screenshot messages and archive emails without leaving traces. I memorized the times her phone buzzed with late-night meetings and the names that appeared and disappeared. I watched the comings and goings of Marcus Hale through the service entrance on nights she said she'd be working late. I logged license plates, restaurant names, hotel chains. I turned my hurt into a ledger. I also dug where it hurt, into finances. I taught myself enough about corporate structures to trace payments. A misfiled expense here. A friendly vendor whose invoice was funneled through a shell company there. She was sloppy in arrogance. Money gives people courage to be careless. I followed the crooked arrows from her expense reports to accounts held under trusts and to the kind of investments that only existed on paper, phantoms designed to launder reputation into profit. Where she used banks and lawyers, I used persistence and late nights with coffee and spreadsheets. There were meetings I couldn't have before. I found a lawyer willing to look over documents for no retainer if I brought them something interesting. Scandal makes even the cautious greedy. I slipped into a reporter's inbox under the guise of a disgruntled former employee and dropped breadcrumbs of evidence. I sat in the shadows of a coffee shop and listened to men talk about board politics the way a patient fisherman watches for ripples. I learned to recognize the difference between loyalty and convenience. Most importantly, I sought the human cracks in her armor. Power isn't a solid thing, it has hinges. She relied on people who were rewarded for obedience. There are always people at the margins, assistants, cleaners, drivers, who see things the shiny people never do. I started reaching out. At first it was casual, disarmingly foolish. "Do you remember that party?" I'd say, voice small. "I'm sorry I embarrassed you." Flattery and contrition are useful tools when you have nothing else to give. I also perfected the act of being harmless. At parties I laughed in the right places. In front of friends I fumbled with my phone. At board dinners, I let her dominate the conversation while I listened and stored. I learned to take the punchlines she threw at me and hand them back as jokes later, understood now as performance, not reality. She never suspected that my passivity was a strategy. The shattered mirror became my symbol. Every time I passed the bathroom where I'd smashed the glass, I felt less like a victim and more like an investigator. Each shard caught a different angle of the truth. I taped pieces together in my head until the reflection showed me not the man she mocked but a strategist shaped by hurt and sharpened by purpose. Class war isn't about fists, it's about rules. She had lawyers. I was cunning. She bought influence. I bought time. Where she spent to bury things, I spent to reveal them, on a freelance auditor here, a discreet private investigator there, tiny investments that paid in openings. I made alliances with people who despised her for reasons she never understood. A fired executive who'd been humiliated in her office, a vendor she'd discarded without payment, a former friend who'd been left embarrassed at a charity gala. I cultivated grudges like seeds. And I learned an important lesson: arrogance is a blindfold. The richer someone is, the more they assume the world bends for them. My wife thought wealth made her invisible to reproach. She thought that to mess with her was to invite failure on the other side, because the other side didn't exist. She didn't see that hunger can be a sharper tool than cash. I moved like smoke through her life, soft and unseen. I let her keep believing the comfortable narrative, that I was the fragile one, the contented husband. Meanwhile, I stitched my case stitch by stitch. I copied files, ordered certified statements, recorded conversations where she bragged, her voice like ice. I planted subtle doubts in the minds of the people who'd never thought to question her. I fed a reporter a tip about a misreported contract. I slipped a copy of an expense report under a board member's door. Every action was measured to make the house of cards tremble, not collapse, yet. The person I never expected to be the key was the closest, someone inside her sanctum who saw everything but was overlooked because of their position. They knew passwords, schedules, moods. They witnessed the late-night arrivals, the hushed laughter, the way her hand would find Marcus's in the dark. I'd seen them, quiet, efficient, invisible by design. When I first approached them, they looked at me like I was a joke. Then they smirked, as if they'd been waiting for me to grow a backbone. "You're serious?" they asked, in a tone that mixed amusement and long-simmering anger. I nodded. They smiled the way people smile when vindication is finally on the table. "Good," they said. "Because I'm tired of being the one who cleans up after her." And just like that, the ally I needed most stepped forward. The one whose knowledge would unravel the lies from the inside. The night I let her fall, I felt nothing for a second that resembled triumph. It was quieter, like watching a building you've fed termites to finally give way. I stood in the back of the ballroom, the shattered mirror tucked in my head like a map, and watched her perform. She loved galas, the lights, the orchestra, the way people looked up at her as if she were a lighthouse. Marcus was there, of course, orbiting her like a moon. She wore the dress from the honeymoon photo, the one that used to make me think of forever. Now it looked like armor. I didn't go in with a microphone. That would have been petty. I let the room do the work. A friend at the paper had promised he'd play it right. He'd agreed to run the piece only when the crowd was largest, maximize humiliation, minimize chance for damage control. My ally, her assistant, sent me the exact time Marcus and she always slipped away to the terrace. I timed everything down to the waiter's tray clinks. When the band finished a piece and the room pulled its breath in to applaud, the large screens above the stage flickered. For a second, they showed the charity logos and smiling faces. Then, without fanfare, a slideshow rolled, the honeymoon photo, Marcus's messages, her text thread calling me a project, the photo of their hands at a hotel with a receipt captioned, Suite 712, 2:14 a.m. Gasps spilled like dominoes. A woman shrieked. Forks clattered. People turned, eyes wide, the tinsel of accidental witnesses catching the scandal and magnifying it. I watched her face go through stages, confusion, calculation, fury, then the practiced mask. She reached for the microphone like a reflex. Her voice, so practiced for speeches, came out brittle. "This is a fabrication," she said. "Someone's trying to," her words dissolved under the thunder of cameras. She tried to joke. She tried to charm me. But the slide that followed wasn't about lovers. It was transactions, invoices she'd signed, shell companies, vendor payments rerouted to Marcus's consulting firm. The slideshow didn't accuse. It proved, document by document, that the woman everyone hailed as brilliant had been moving money like a magician moves cards. Outside, the lights went wild. Inside, her empire had been reduced to a series of receipts and screenshots. The gala's noise turned ugly. People shuffled toward the exits in small packs, whispering. Her friend with the paper came up to me afterwards, eyes bright with adrenaline. "You did this," he said. I didn't answer. I kept my hands in my pockets and watched her slink to the coatroom, shoulders shaking, not from grief but from the kind of fear that comes when the chessboard flips. Marcus was gone. Her smile had disappeared. The next day, anonymous tips landed in 3 places: the regulator, an investigative journalist, and the firm's compliance hotline. I made sure everything I'd gathered was delivered in airtight packets, transaction logs, voice recordings, the assistant's folder of calendar entries proving meetings at odd hours. The financial whistleblower we'd hired prepared a forensic audit and attached a memo that read like a scalpel. The auditor's footnote showed a pattern: assets shifted through shell entities to hide losses and funnel reputation into private accounts. Once the press had traction, the board had to act. Boards hate uncertainty more than scandal. They call meetings in sterile rooms with coffee that tastes like cardboard and decide on futures with the speed of ritual. I watched from a distance as emails stacked, as phone calls became terse. Votes were whispered in private rooms. The rumor mill accelerated into a verdict before anyone had publicly spoken. Her father called her first. He had built the company. He was its myth and its mortgage. I'd seen them together at family events. An old lion and a daughter who had learned to roar louder. The call that followed the articles was short. "You stupid girl," he hissed across the line, temptation and fury mixed. "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed the family." Then, voice like a guillotine, cut off. For someone who'd never known what it was to be told no, being cut off was as close to death as money gets. Her access froze. Lines of credit she'd relied on vanished. Her black card declined. The people who had smiled at her for years suddenly claimed to have been misled. The public humiliation was one thing. The private dismantling was worse. I watched her unravel in ways the cameras couldn't catch. In the quiet hours she began to bleed into old behaviors, pleading, bargaining, oscillating between rage and childish pleading. "You can't do this," she said to me once, voice small in my apartment kitchen as rain smeared the city outside. "Please. Stay. Don't ruin me." I'd expected manipulative monologues. I'd rehearsed my coldness. Instead, when she grabbed my wrist and looked at me as if I were the only person with oxygen in the room, something primitive in me stirred. Maybe it was the memory of how she'd once told me she'd take care of me. Maybe it was the man who had been humiliated and wanted his hand back on the wheel. "I can't," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. She moved from apologies to accusations overnight. That was a tactic I'd anticipated. If you strip power from someone like her, they will swing to reclaim it and they will use everything they have: lawyers, PR, influence. She tried to frame me for fraud. Documents appeared, curated to look like I had been authorizing transfers, emails with my name attached. A police report landed in my inbox before I even knew it had been filed: allegations of embezzlement, falsified signatures, money trail pointing to me. She didn't invent anything she couldn't plant. She had resources. She thought the legal net would close around me, that the city would jail swap my life for headlines she could spin. But she'd underestimated the thoroughness of my preparation. When you plan a war, you plan defense as obsessively as offense. I had recorded conversations of her instructing vendors, I had copies of the invoices with timestamps she couldn't fake, and I had a chain of custody for every file I'd shared with the press and the regulator. More importantly, I had witnesses: the assistant who'd been with her through every late night, the vendor who'd been paid by a shell company, the auditor who'd traced the transactions. When the police came to my door, they left with questions rather than cuffs. When lawyers for her PR firm tried to shut down the article, they found themselves facing subpoenas. When she sent me a cease and desist drafted in a tone of threat, I forwarded it, to the board, to the press, to the regulator, everywhere it would wound her. The escalation felt surgical. Public humiliation had broken her veneer. Whistleblowing had started the financial erosion. The board, hungry to protect share value, convened and, within days, voted to place her on leave pending an investigation. They appointed an independent committee. The company's stock dipped and thrummed like an animal with a broken leg. She begged. She raged. She plotted. She called names, threatened suits, made a public spectacle on daytime news where she auditioned for victimhood and failed. Meanwhile, my ally worked quietly inside, accessing calendars, forwarding invoices, unlocking doors I could not open. She gave the board the proof that finally made the vote inevitable. Then came the last piece I hadn't expected: a letter slid under my door the morning the board's emergency meeting began. It was short. Printed on company letterhead. My name at the top. "We need you in the boardroom. Interim appointment pending vote. Board secretary." My hands went cold. The elevator ride up felt like a pendulum swing between everything I had lost and everything I might take. The wine glass in the penthouse memory trembled in my mind, a toast I could no longer drink. The shattered mirror's reflection sharpened: the husband who had been laughed at, the strategist who had been invisible, and the man stepping into a room where, with a nod, he could sit in the chair that had framed her power. The doors opened. The boardroom smelled like old leather and new endings. My phone buzzed, another message from my ally: "They don't see it coming." I placed the envelope on the table and sat down. The meeting began with procedural announcements and the hum of air conditioning. Then the chair looked at me across the polished wood, and someone cleared their throat. "Mr. Ellis," the secretary said. "Given the circumstances, the board is prepared to name an interim CEO. We need someone to steady the ship." My heart beat a drum I'd heard my whole life: the sound of risk. "Are you volunteering?" someone asked, eyes sharp. I folded my hands. I could feel her face in my mind: white dress, brittle smile, the man beside her in the photograph who'd stolen her laughter. Outside, the city kept breathing. Inside, every eye was on me. The final move hung in the air, heavy and possible. And I realized, for the first time since the photograph slid from my hand onto the floor, that the fall was not the end. I heard about her collapse in pieces, scattered like debris after a storm. The papers showed photos of her leaving the courthouse, sunglasses too big for her face, skin pale without the armor of wealth and power. The woman who once commanded boardrooms now looked like she was shrinking into herself, wrapped in a coat that seemed heavier than her body. Her reputation was gone. The gala humiliation, the whistleblower reports, the board's vote, they had carved her into a cautionary tale. Her father disowned her publicly. Marcus evaporated the moment the money bled out. Former friends stopped answering her calls. Even the assistant she once dismissed with a snap of her fingers had become a witness against her. And me? I walked through the city with no shadow stretching out behind me anymore. For years, I had been her accessory, her project, her charity case. Now, when I passed by shop windows and caught my reflection, I saw myself, not a man orbiting someone else's son. The scars were there, etched into my eyes, my posture, the way I sometimes caught myself flinching at nothing. But scars aren't just reminders of pain. They're proof you survived it. I didn't stay with the company. Power that comes from ashes is still ash. I stepped away before they could paint me as the man who replaced her. I built something smaller, but it was mine, a consulting business with no golden leash attached. Clients came because of me, not because of her name stamped on a card. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a penthouse overlooking the skyline. But when I walked into my office and locked the door behind me, I knew every brick belonged to me. One night, months after the final board vote, I stood alone in my kitchen. The city outside was the same, indifferent, buzzing with lights and noise. On the counter sat a bottle of wine, her wine, unopened since the night she'd told me she hated me. I pulled the cork and poured a glass. The liquid swirled dark and heavy, carrying the echo of all the nights I'd watched her sip it while I sat silent, invisible. I lifted the glass, held it in the light. For a moment, I thought of drinking it. To toast survival, to put the past to rest. But then I remembered the taste, bitter, heavy, masking everything it touched. I set the glass down. And then, with a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed, I smashed it against the sink. Red liquid sprayed across porcelain, dripping like blood down the drain. The shards glittered under the kitchen light, and I realized that was the true toast, not drinking, but breaking. Refusing to swallow her world anymore. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. I thought of her one last time, alone somewhere in a room without windows, clinging to fragments of the empire she'd built out of lies. She had told me once that she hated me, calm and measured, wine glass in hand. I hadn't believed her then. I thought hate required passion, and she was too cold for that. But hate has many forms. Sometimes it's indifference, sometimes control, sometimes the cruel laughter of someone who never saw you as more than a prop. Now, standing in my kitchen, hands steady despite the shards, I finally understood. She told me she hated me once. But when I left, I finally believed her. The end.